edition of Maine Social Justice, you are going to hear about a murder case and a story of justice, or grave injustice, depending on your interpretation of the facts. After you hear from 4 people with a wealth of information about the case, you will be the jury in the court of public opinion. Unlike the jury that convicted Dennis DeShane 17 years ago, you will have access to evidence that was unknown and even concealed from the jury at the original trial. I met Bernie Heebner last summer at the Common Ground Fair, where he was working the American Civil Liberties booth. In Bernie's opinion, Dennis was wrongfully convicted of the torture and murder of 12-year-old Sarah Cherry in Bowdoin. That was 18 years ago. Bernie told me that after reading the book Human Sacrifice, he had joined with a group called Trial and Error. This group contends that Dennis is innocent of the crime and insists that a retrial would find him so. Bernie told me that he would get Bill Bunting of Trial and Error to send me a copy of James P. Moore's book, Human Sacrifice, and that if I read it, I would understand how he felt. This is a book that Bill sent me. It's the revised 2nd edition of Human Sacrifice. This edition reveals new state secrets. I might also add that author Jim Moore, a retired ATF agent, took no royalties on the book, donating them all to the group Trial and Error. I agreed to reading the book and said that if I was even partially convinced of DeShane's innocence, I would do a Maine social justice show about it. I read the book, I was convinced, and here we are. And now, based on what I read in the book, and I'd like to learn more, I'm going to talk to Jim Moore, author of Human Sacrifice and retired ATF agent. I'm going to speak to Bill Bunting. He's a director of Trial and Error. Steve Sandow, longtime neighbor and friend of Dennis DeShane, and he also happens to be another Trial and Error director. And we'll be talking to Bernie Heebner. He's the most recent member of Trial and Error, and he's a retired school teacher now living in Waterville. All 4 have information about the case that will at least enlighten you, if not even surprise you. I'm going to ask this question for all to answer. How did you first get involved in this case?
Well, I was sitting at home reading the newspaper and saw a little piece that said that there was a bunch of people coming to town, going to have a meeting at a local church and tell the world how Dennis DeShane was innocent. He was wrongfully convicted of murdering Sarah Cherry. I said to myself, there's another bunch of nitwits going to trash law enforcement. I was here when that case went down. I read about it in the paper. I saw the TV coverage. No doubt in my mind that Dennis DeShane killed that little girl. So I went to the meeting. And after listening to the folks talk, I wasn't convinced that Dennis DeShane was innocent by any means, but I was convinced that they were not idiots. They were sincere folks, and they really believed he was innocent. So I went up to them after the meeting and I said, introduced myself, and said, if you want me to, I'll look into the case. I'll check out all these little discrepancies you've been talking about, and I'll let you know what I find out. Of course, if I find out something that hurts Mr. DeShane, I'm going to tell that to the authorities. And they said, fine, that's okay. And so I went and asked Dennis DeShane, and he said, fine, that's good, go for it. And I figured it would take me a week or 2, maybe a month. It's now been 16 years.
The case, at the time it happened, I didn't know Dennis. I knew some people who knew him, although I'm not sure I ever talked to them about it. But the case never made sense. I read the newspapers, watched TV, and I was very surprised when the verdict came out. And I figured that must have been something that the jury saw during that trial, or some information they got that somehow the press had not communicated, to try and put my mind at rest that justice had been done. but try as I might, whenever I saw anything in the paper about this case in later years, it jumped right out at me. And I had a friend, for example, who went to Union Fair as a farmer, and he was at the pulling ring. And this is several years after the verdict, and he got talking to some guards about the case and said it was just DeShane fellow guilty. And I think there were 3 or 4 guards there, and every one said that no, that guy doesn't belong in prison. And then I read in the paper about Jim's book. I went right out, immediately bought a copy. I read it right through an entire night, and I don't think I slept for the next 3 days, or at least it was on my mind. It just astonished me, and I went out and I bought a dozen copies. I gave them to people, and then what the book convinced me of was that Dennis had not gotten a fair trial. It did not convince me that he was necessarily innocent or guilty, because I didn't feel I knew enough about some of the evidence that Jim presented, which had to do with time of death. I did have a friend who was a retired medical examiner, and I should say I was enough concerned about the fact that he hadn't gotten a fair trial that I was determined to try to help trial and error, but I hadn't made the jump to the fact that I was certain that he was innocent or guilty. And I had my friend go over, meet with Jim, and went over all the time of death evidence, and he gave Jim an A+. And that was pretty important. And at that time I went to meet Dennis, and I was amazed at this guy. He was an absolutely wonderful man, and what he had put up with was something that I'm not sure how many people could have survived the way he has survived. And I'd say at that point I was 99% convinced that there was no way he could have done this crime, and I still left a little room for any possibilities of getting new information. And then I had probably an hour talk on the telephone with Deputy Attorney General Bill Stokes about the case. And after that conversation, I was 110% convinced that there was no way that Dennis could have done this crime. All I saw there was a very strong desire to believe that Dennis was guilty, but with no facts to back it up. And now, 4 years later, I'm still on the job.
I got involved in this case because I was friends with Dennis for a couple of years before this all happened, because he's somebody who had helped me do lots of different things. I came to know him, appreciate his company, his sense of humor. He and his wife and I and my wife used to share dinners together, do things together. When there was some job that was just dirty and grubby and you needed a hand with it, Dennis was always the one who was willing to help do that kind of thing. He helped me put a new furnace in the house that I was living in at the time, which involved taking out part of the floor. Several of us helped Dennis put up a greenhouse in Brunswick. He had lots of friends, all extremely nice people, and we really enjoyed working on different projects together. Dennis, though, had this naive belief, one that I shared at the time, that if you didn't do anything wrong, you couldn't get in trouble for it, basically. And we were all extremely surprised when Dennis was arrested for this crime. Couldn't believe that this could possibly have happened. I mean, Dennis and his wife Nancy had talked about raising rabbits and couldn't do it because Dennis couldn't even take them to be slaughtered. He couldn't bear to take these little rabbits and have them killed. So I couldn't believe for an instant that he'd done this to start with. After the verdict came out, we were all even more surprised that the jury didn't find him innocent. Now that we find out some of the things that were going on behind the scenes, thanks to Jim's book and some other things, it begins to make a little more sense as to why the jury decided what they did. But we still don't believe that that was a decision arrived at honestly, because they didn't know all the things that were going on. They didn't know all the facts. At this point, we're working uphill, trying to get all the information that's pertinent to the case to be public knowledge, and to get people to understand that a lot of things that they have heard about this may not be true. Hopefully at some point we will actually get a new trial for Dennis, and we'll find out some of the other things that happened and some of the reasons that he was convicted, and maybe we'll be able to help prevent this from happening to other people.
I guess I'm a prime example of the kind of people who are perhaps listening to this program right now. I really didn't have much of a memory of the DeShane trial when it took place in the late 80s. Anything I had noticed reading in the newspaper I'd long forgotten. So I was kind of surprised when a member of Trial and Error, whom I knew in another way, came up to me and handed me a book and said, "You've got to read this." This was Jim Moore's book, Human Sacrifice. And just like Bill Bunting, I went home, couldn't put it down. The next day was profoundly disturbed, not just because of what appeared to be a miscarriage of justice in Dennis's case, but also what it said about the whole apparatus of the judiciary and the trial process and how easily it could be misled. So I'm probably an example of somebody who's come to this late, but been galvanized by what I've read, and the more in fact I find out as the interest in the case continues, the more imperative it becomes to keep this movement going, to find enough people to bring some energy to bear to get Dennis a retrial.
Initially, there was an assumption of guilt. Just what was the first thing that made you doubt that assumption?
Well, I began my investigation of this case by reading the trial transcript and the police reports, those which the prosecution had given to the defense. The law requires that prosecutors give the defense anything they have which may tend to prove him guilty or may tend to prove him not guilty. So I was reviewing this and I came across the testimony of the medical examiner regarding the time of death. Now that hadn't been on the autopsy report they gave the defense. But when the doctor came to testify, he said that when he conducted the autopsy, Sarah Cherry had been dead for somewhere between 30 to 36 hours. And that kind of caught my attention. He threw in later that, well, she could have been dead a little longer than that. But that caught my attention enough to go through the autopsy report and see what his observations had been regarding rigor mortis and decomposition. And I wanted to find more, so I went up to, I could other pathologists. And one of them told me that the autopsy report looked like a preliminary report. She said, "Where's the rest of it?" So I went up to Augusta, to the medical examiner's office, and here this case had been, a verdict had been through 4 years earlier, 3 years earlier, and I asked for a copy of the autopsy file. And the clerk said, "Well, I'll have to ask the Attorney General's office about that." I said, "Fine, go ahead and ask him." So she goes to the other end of the room, uses the phone, and comes back and says that Mr. LaRochelle, now he was the Deputy Attorney General at the time, Mr. LaRochelle says, "Show you what we gave DeShane's lawyer and nothing else." I thought to myself, nothing else is not supposed to be anything else legally. So I consulted more pathologists, and this is what I found